It's September 15th, 2022. I'm Robert Michael Smith, board member, one of the founding board members of the Digital Stone Project. And today I'm doing an interview with Walter Dusenbery, who's actually our founder of the Digital Stone Project. And we're going to be discussing briefly his personal history, and we'll be spending most of this conversation discussing the formation of the Digital Stone Division at Johnson Atelier, which then eventually became the Digital Stone Project.
My life with art began with my incredible fascination with dance. And as a mid-teenager, I had left home because I had a rather unhappy childhood at home life, and I studied dance at the San Francisco Ballet, and and went to school and supported myself by working little odd jobs at Berkeley High School, and that was a great environment. That led to me, Lamone at Juilliard and Martha Graham. I came to a point where I decided I needed to have more control. I wasn't satisfied with the group activity that dance is. And I, again, was always desperate for money. And I thought that I would use my abilities to find some way I could make things. And I landed an apprenticeship with Wildenhain, Marguerite Wildenhain, an ex-Bauhaus teacher who was in California, and learned to make pottery. I thought, well, that would be the perfect thing. I mean, she taught me how to make pottery, and I would be able to make a living. But it turned out that my pottery, I was more interested in the textures and shapes of things than in just making utilitarian pottery. I became one of the first people to engage in a kind of pottery called raku, which are really free-form sort of pottery. Sure. And then that led, those pots or those cups, teacups, became items that a lot of people in the Zen community wanted. And I also was a member of the early Zen community there in San Francisco with the Zen Center. But my work, the ceramics started getting larger and larger. And if you know ceramics, you're limited by the kind of shrinkage and what happens to it. I attended some classes early on at the San Francisco Art Institute and in sculpture and ceramics. And my work in ceramics had led to me being an instructor at the San Francisco extension of the University of California. Of course, there were some big names at times. Voulkos was the primary guy, but he was very generous to me and, let me do whatever I wanted to do, which was basically my mode of living in those days. This led to, I guess, one of the most instrumental things that led to my career was I was told by a lady who had collected some of my work that Richard Neutra was coming to town. And she said, you might really like to meet him. I said, oh, sure. And he was giving a reception for the county of Marin County. They'd had a fire, their town hall had burned down, and he was an architect being considered for that. So I appeared at this reception. It was all the kind of business types and civic leaders, and I was in this reception line, and I got up and to him. He was receiving people there, and I shook his hand, and as I was shaking his hand, he pulled me into him real close, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I came here to meet you." And he says, "You got to get out right away." I said, "Really?" He said, "Oh, yes." And and then I was moved on, you know. And so I managed to connect with him a little later during his reception. And I said, you know, would you honor me by coming by to my studio and seeing the work I'm doing? And he said yes. And the next day he did come by my studio with his wife and looked at my work. And he said, if you want to be an artist of consequence in the world, you have to go where world energy is focused. And I said, well, where's world energy focused? He said, only two places right now, Dusseldorf or Tokyo. I said, okay. And I said, can we keep in touch? And he said, oh, yes, we'll write to each other. Well, 2 weeks later, I was on an airplane to Tokyo. Sold everything, which was, you know, like books and records, you know. And in Tokyo, I had a bit of, again, extraordinary good fortune. I'd had a student, and he had been kind of shunned, a Japanese student, because he was working very much in an Oriental style. And I quite liked the aesthetic that he was trying to develop. Well, it turned out he was married to an Iwasaki. That's one of the Zaibatsu families in Japan, I mean, ruling families. And he phoned me in Tokyo. He said, just be prepared to move within an hour. I was staying in this downtown Shinjuku, which is sort of the bohemian area, a lot of musicians in this hotel, a cheap hotel. And I got a call and it said, yeah, you're going to move like in an hour. This was Shinsuke, my friend. And all of a sudden, these three limousines pulled up, Mercedes limousines. And this tall, elegant guy got out, spoke perfect English, and said, you know, I'm Shinsuke's brother-in-law, and we're going to give you a house where you can stay while you're here. So they took me to this incredible home outside of us in the suburbs, a whole city block, enclosed within a wall, totally self-sufficient, had its own spring. And he said, we decided this house was the right house for you because it has Western-style toilets.
Thank God.
Yeah. And there I came to the attention of a local artist, Hiroi, a kite artist. And I mean, you know, being a gaijin, foreigner in Tokyo at that point, this is 1969, you know, it's like you stand out. I mean, everywhere you go, everyone says, oh, gaijin. Anyway, Hiroi sought me out, and we got together, and he was looking at pictures of my work, and he said, you know, really the medium that you're searching for is stone. He said, you really need to look at that. We got an airplane the next day, he hired an airplane. We flew down there, and it was fantastic. I mean, it was just, you know, all this granite around and beautiful places. And he said, well, why don't you stay here for a couple of weeks? So we went to his house, and he said, you can have this house. I mean, it was like a really huge adventure. And okay. I discovered it was the house and studio of Noguchi. They put me in Noguchi's house. They said, well, Noguchi's not here, so you can use the house. The Japanese are very much this way. I mean, it's just, and actually Noguchi didn't own the house. It was owned by a guy who had a huge stone yard. So I was in that house and got very nervous because his stuff was all around. And I was somewhat uncomfortable because I thought, you know, he's going to see me as a trespasser or something. And then the powers that be on the island came to meet me, and they said we should have lunch every day. We want to know more about you. So we'd go to lunch every day, And we'd also end up by drinking green tea. And the green tea they serve in Japan, I don't know if you've experienced that or not, they whisk it up. It's like a powder, they whisk it up. And it's like taking a strong stimulant. You feel, ooh, you know, you kind of hits you and you stand up with it. And so we drink that, and I could not speak Japanese, and so we, you know, was sort of sitting there and looking at each other every day for about a week. At the end of the week, it was a head architect, the governor, and the head Buddhist priest. And they said to me, well, we've assessed your quality of heart, and we like it. So you can work here. And they said, you know, you'll be the first American ever to work here because we have a Japanese sculptor, Nagara at that time, and we have a half Japanese, half American, and so you'll become the first American. So I was given permission, and they gave me another house, little place in the stone yard, supplied me food. Anywhere I'd go, I could not pay. Everyone knew I was there. People would drive by to sort of see the gaijin, you know. And I would go out to a restaurant, I'd go to buy a loaf of bread, and I'd go to pay, and they said, no, you can't pay. It was just such a weird experience. I went to buy a typewriter, I went back to the mainland, and I wanted to get a typewriter with, you know, Romanji. So I could, and the guy got the typewriter out, gave it to me, and how do I pay? No. He knew in another island who I was. It was very weird. So then Noguchi arrived, and he was quite upset to see that I was there. Well, the other thing is I had a meeting with Nagara. The meeting with Nagara was fantastic. He was living like a baron in a big castle, and I go in there and get up to the hill, walk up, go inside, and he has a bonfire going in the center of his main room with an open in the center through the ceiling. And he makes an entrance in a sort of like an African hunter's jacket. And he says, he waves on me, this is all my stuff. And he says, I want to show you something. And he took me over and he showed me he had a red enamel bathroom. It was the most scary thing I had ever seen. He said, I bought that in the United States. And so I was with Hiroi, who did speak English. And he said, okay, he says, we're going to have a meeting. So we get upstairs, and he has a little tea room. And in the tea rooms, they open a door, which you have to crawl through. And it's very tight, so you can't carry a weapon. So we crawl into this room, a circular room, and nothing in it but some pillows to sit on, and a bowl in the center, which has nothing in it, just the void, and a light that is directed, natural light, which makes the void glow. And we're sitting around it, and the first thing he says to me is, you're not strong enough to cut stone. And I'm thinking, this is, you know, we're just off in weirdo land by this time. And so I said, if we're in weirdo land, I'll just, you know, I said, my name is Walter, and water wears stone away. And it was translated, and he went like this, he sort of went kind of rigid. And then he bowed at me, and he said, you can work here. And that was it. And so we go out, and Hiroi was laughing like crazy. As we were leaving, I said, what's so funny? He said, there was no way in the world he could deny you, because he's from a samurai family, and samurais assume a name, and the name he assumed was Water. And so, you know, there bit, yeah, incredible bit of good fortune. Noguchi came. He first was angry, and then we became friends. And had dinner frequently together, and he said to me, you know, I want to invite you to come with me to Italy, because I work in Italy also, and see what's happening there. And I've arranged with Giancarlo Menotti to have an invitation for you to the Festival of Two Worlds. So when you go back, you're going to meet me in Italy at this time, at this cafe. And I went back to San Francisco and went on to Italy and met him there. And in fact, he was there right at the same time in the piazza at this little cafe. I was like, had gone for 48 hours. I'd flown Icelandic Airlines, you know, the usual artist way to get to Europe and Luxembourg and then trains. And I was practically falling asleep on my feet, but met him and he introduced me to Giancarlo Menotti. And then I was set up to room with Ezra Pound and other notables, Buckminster Fuller and a number of other, Ruth Page, marvelous people. And I felt like I'd really arrived in the sense that I saw that there was a life in being an artist. And then we went up and stayed at Gorky's house, and then on to Pietrasanta, where he introduced me again to someone fabulous, a guy named Chidonio, who owned Enro. And Enro gave me, the Enro place gave me a studio next to Henry Moore and Marino Marini, who were there at the time, and everything was free. It was marvelous. So and then I had I developed a relationship with Henry Moore, who was a very generous individual, and he introduced me in a film of the BBC called Man's Work with His Hands. He introduced me as a young sculptor, which was very kind of him. And you know, seeing how Marino Marini worked, he was very secretive, he was very elegant, dressed up. He'd crawl through the window in the back of the studio so no one would see him. And the other workers would say, "Oh, the maestro's in attendance, you know." And he you know, he would always have a cravat, very, very beautifully dressed. And he was doing those fallen horse things at the time. And Moore was into these very huge, very large works that he was doing, enlarging them. So I just learned an immense amount just from the proximity of being with these guys. I found a studio there, which I eventually bought over the years, but then after a few months, I went back to New York and was staying in a hotel on credit cards. Always fearful of being told I was going to be kicked out. And Noguchi invited me for dinner, and he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go back to California where people know me and I can make some money." He said, "Well," he said, "you've been around the world," he said, "and you finally got yourself here in New York, so why don't you stay?" I said, "How will I do that?" He said, "Well, I'd like you to be my assistant." He said, "I have a big project coming on, and you can help me with it." I really say that's the beginning of my professional career. And he was a very difficult individual. I mean, that's another whole story, complicated and difficult. But I helped him with this huge project. And the end of the project, I mean, I think the kindest thing he ever said to me was, he said, "Now you know how to do it. Get out there and do it." And I mean, we kept in touch, and but that was the beginning of my career.